Hi, I'm Victor Lucas from the Electric Playground, and I've been covering video games for more than 20 years, and a franchise that's always been a bit of an enigma to me is Fire Emblem. With the release of Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia almost upon us, I got together with Nintendo, and together we decided to dig into the history and the resonance of this venerable franchise. Nintendo's Andrew Collins.
For a lot of people in the West, they think it's probably like 10, 15 years old, but it's actually the first game came out in 1990. It was developed by a group that were later to become Intelligent Systems. They wanted to look at the RPG, but kind of put their own twist on it because they'd made Famicom Wars, which as you know, turned into Advance Wars, one of the greatest strategy games I've ever played. And so they took the Famicom Wars, and then they applied like an RPG filter to it. But they made this hybrid between the two, and while being very quiet to the West, it's absolutely revolutionary in terms of gameplay.
It was a tremendous success on Nintendo's Famicom system in Japan, and largely because the gameplay was so unique.
When Fire Emblem came along, it was one of the first games that really had a big story, and the Japanese gamers kind of resonated to that a lot. It had characters that you would actually get involved with. It had cutscenes, this is like 27 years ago, and it had cutscenes, and it's because of this that Fire Emblem became such a classic game.
The gameplay resonated with fans of traditional role-playing games and made them turn-based strategy fans.
We could see that role-playing games were already really popular at that point in Japan, but this was, for people who were kind of more interested in tactical games and not necessarily the really hardcore RPG games, this gave people an entryway into that type of gameplay. They could play like an RPG light element to it, but they could still do all the tactical side of things that they liked from Famicom Wars.
If the first Fire Emblem game for the Famicom was a groundbreaking out-of-nowhere surprise, the sequel, Fire Emblem Gaiden, cemented the idea that this franchise was built to last.
When Fire Emblem Gaiden was in development, they thought, well, we like the original, but there are tweaks that we can make. And so they made all these little changes, and it was kind of like a very similar version to the first one, but they went back and they added more RPG stats and increased elements like the overworld. But it's interesting because the fans of Fire Emblem didn't quite like that, and if you look back at the history of Fire Emblem now, everyone calls that one the black sheep. There's fans all over the world, particularly in the West where it didn't get released. It was solely a Japanese release. There are people, they're interested in, well, why was this game a black sheep? I want to try it out, and now with Fire Emblem Echoes, people can try it out. 3
more elaborate sequels followed Fire Emblem Gaiden in Japan for Nintendo's Super Famicom system. The first was Mystery of the Emblem.
One of the big things about shifting to the Super Famicom was that the dev team were finally able to get hold of the extra memory that they were desperately looking for with the Famicom games. And the first one of those was the Mystery of the Emblem. So what they did with that one, they went back to the first game again. So clearly there was a vein that they really felt there was something in the first one that they needed to work with. They were able to give it the graphics they felt it deserved. They changed the storyline a little bit, not a huge amount, but on top of that, they actually added a sequel right into the same game. So people used to playing these small games on the Famicom, then suddenly this massive, massive game.
Mystery of the Emblem was followed by Genealogy of the Holy War.
The key thing about the Genealogy of the Holy War, apart from it being one of my favourite game titles ever, is that it made the scale so much bigger. Instead, the developers were worried that in previous games that you were having these tiny battles just isolated everywhere. When you were playing it was very clear that this was a massive arena that you were fighting in. And obviously the genealogy element hints that there's lots of storyline and there's children, you could even inherit weapons and things like that. So it was just this momentous, all-encompassing game with some great storyline which led into the next game.
The final Super Famicom game was Fire Emblem Thracia 776.
That's kind of one of the most revolutionary games because we have features like the Fog of War, which that introduced. The Fog of War was already a tricky design. That game was so hard. That was a count to 10, start again. So you got Fog of War, you got permadeath. That's hard work, but rewarding.
After several iterations of Fire Emblem for Nintendo's home consoles in Japan, the company and series developer Intelligent Systems felt the time was right to go portable.
When we shifted onto portable with the Binding Blade, there was this sense in the West that they were starting to hear more and more about Fire Emblem as a game series. It was kind of one of those, if you were a really hardcore gamer, you knew what it was, but you were itching to play it.
The first handheld Fire Emblem game was a hit in Japan, and because Super Smash Bros. Melee creator Masahiro Sakurai was such a fan of the franchise, he included Roy from Binding Blade and Marth from the first Fire Emblem in his hit GameCube fighter.
We all know the success of Smash. Every time it's come out, it's been a huge, huge game, and so to introduce those characters from this kind of already mythical game, this game that everybody wants to see, and then suddenly you get like this tiny hint by able to play them in Smash. Surely, that just increased the avalanche saying, please get these games to us.
YouTube's happy console gamer Johnny Millennium.
It was back in 2003. I had my Game Boy SP. I had Advance Wars. I was a huge fan of intelligent systems. And then I find out that they were bringing over another prominent game called Fire Emblem.
The stage was set to finally bring Fire Emblem to North America. I remember it well.
I'm playing some Fire Emblem on my Game Boy Advance SP. I love this game.
I'd never played it. I heard it was a strategy game. I liked medieval stuff. I liked RPGs. I'm like, this game is definitely for me.
But what they've done is added this very cool, complex, deep RPG storyline to it. So you really feel like you're involved with all of these different characters that they're introducing.
My imagination kind of sparked at that point. I thought, what else is out there? And I started to do some research, and I found out there was a lot of other really great Fire Emblem games that were never released in this country.
It's kind of like you watch a movie trilogy, halfway through you go into the second film, so well, what happened in the first one? But you know, the guys did a really good job of introducing the franchise to the Western audience without putting off the Japanese audience at the same time.
After Fire Emblem for the GBA came the Sacred Stones, which was released globally and became the last Fire Emblem made for the Game Boy Advance. And then it was time for the series to take its most elaborate leap yet with Path of Radiance for the GameCube.
Well, I think one of the themes we've seen, even from the very beginning of Fire Emblem, is that the dev team have always wanted more. They've always never been happy with the memory or the capacity of what they've got. So when they shifted back onto console, they had all this more memory they could play with. And one of the key things that they did was they really upped the visual appearance and the presentation. They took it to another level.
Path of Radiance was followed by a sequel, but this time for the hugely popular Nintendo Wii. It was called Radiant Dawn.
When you launch a console like we've just done with Nintendo Switch, you want to make sure that all the fan bases, they're covered. So obviously you had Wii Sports, which is, you know, very, very casual. And then you've got Fire Emblem, which says to the hardcore guys, hey, we've not forgotten about you. Releasing the Fire Emblem on the Wii was a perfect example of like setting the stage, saying, hey, this is a console for everybody.
After successfully reconquering Nintendo's home consoles around the world, it was time for Fire Emblem to return to the portable space. But this time for Nintendo's powerful dual-screened DS with Shadow Dragon.
There's so many great games that never came out in the West. We thought it was time to actually go back and look at the very original game, Shadow Dragon, and then bring it out over here.
I don't speak Japanese, so the very first Fire Emblem game storyline was lost on me completely. So that's why when the DS version came out, it was so cool to finally be able to play the story and find out who all these characters are and what they were all doing.
But instead of just kind of doing a copy and paste, obviously we didn't want to do that. We wanted to make sure that it was a special version. Like Fire Emblem Echoes, there's a ton of new stuff for that wasn't in Gaiden. This was the first time on the DS the developers had the two screens to play with. It was a reimagining of the classic original game, the game that got everyone started and fell in love with Fire Emblem as a franchise.
It turned out that two screens was a perfect fit for strategy RPGs. A Japan-only release of New Mystery of the Emblem, an enhanced remake of the Super Famicom original, hit the DS in 2010. But after that, Fire Emblem was about to begin a long and significant run on Nintendo's 3DS.
Fire Emblem Awakening was a very important game for Nintendo. They had a lot riding on it sales-wise. If the game didn't hit certain sales figures, the series could be in jeopardy.
By this point, the Fire Emblem experience on a portable is very established. It allowed the developers that freedom to actually focus on the gameplay, focus on the visuals.
We were going from the GameCube and Wii versions into a 3DS version of the game, and they had to make it exceptional, and they did that with the dual screens, the graphics. It exceeded and was better than the console versions.
Fire Emblem was more popular than ever. The perfect time to release the most ambitious game in the franchise yet, Fire Emblem Fates.
Telling a story has always been one of the key reasons for making the game. And then when we get to Fire Emblem Fates, you've got the two games, you've got Birthright and Conquest, where it's got this great idea where it's a similar storyline and they start off the same, the first 6 chapters are the same, but then they split, so you can play the bad guy or the good guy, and it gives you a really interesting way of, you know, what spin do you want to put on it.
I really enjoyed Fire Emblem Fates. I like the different storylines, I like the graphics, I like the ambition.
We weren't worried about the size, we were thinking about where does this take the story, and the Birthright Conquest split was such a convincing way that it was, you know, we were confident that the fans would enjoy it. The interesting thing for us was kind of like having bets, which one would sell better, good or bad.
Which one did?
It was actually really split down the middle.
And that brings us to present day. Millions of mobile gamers around the world are playing Fire Emblem Heroes, a taste test of the Fire Emblem franchise that is bringing new players to the series every day.
It's one of those great franchises which we feel that some people may not have been aware of it because they see it as this hardcore RPG. So by releasing Heroes, it takes some of the core elements off, but it keeps the fun main battle mechanics. As we go, there's a lot more Fire Emblem coming out. We've got Fire Emblem Warriors this year on 3DS and Nintendo Switch. And then next year there is a Nintendo Switch devoted Fire Emblem title.
There's always been console versions of it. There's always been portable versions of it. So I'm still happy that it's on the 3DS, and I know that around the corner we're going to get a Switch version that will be both versions.
But before we get to the Switch, we get to play Echoes.
What's really cool about this game is that I have so many friends that live in Japan that have played this game that are always telling me how this is one of the best in the series, and I've always been jealous about it because I'm like, I want to play this game, I want to see what it's all about. And finally with Echoes, we can play a 3DS version and find out the story.
What we wanted to do is see how we can take 1990s game design and bring it to 2017. One of the great things is all the characters are voiced. Again, it's increasing that cinematic gameplay that we'd expect. And we've also introduced the dungeons. Dungeons have been in the game before, but not the 3D third person. You're actually fighting within the dungeons. We've got the 2 new amiibo that are coming out, and all the original Smash Bros. Fire Emblem amiibo, they all work. And it's this great thing where you can just tap them in and they will come and help you in a battle. You don't control them, but it's pretty nice to have Marth come to your side while you're in one of these hard battles.
Thank you for joining me on this short journey through the massive world of Fire Emblem. These games are filled with adventure, tons of tricky situations, and characters that you fall in love with. Keep your eyes locked on our channel for more coverage of Fire Emblem and Echoes: Shadows of Valentia.
It's really nice to see Fire Emblem doing as well as it's doing nowadays, because when I first discovered it back on the Game Boy Advance SP, it was a very hardcore, passionate audience, and I think we all wanted to see other players embrace the series and for the series to grow over time, and it has. I want everybody to play the game. I want everybody to enjoy the strategy elements, to enjoy the medieval elements of the game, because it's such a fun series, and I'm so excited that everybody's discovering it nowadays.
Now we feel like Fire Emblem is mainstream. Pictures of Marth and Roy will be going up there with Mario, Luigi, Pikachu. It's their coming of age.